Welcome back to U.S. History. You may have noticed I added a short video clip that I found online that was the campaign commercial by President Johnson used in the 1964 election against Barry Goldwater. Again, that commercial was aired only one time because it had such a dramatic response by the watchers of it. But it's been recorded, and of course now we have it online. People can see it anytime they want. It's just interesting what the campaign commercials were like back then as compared to today's commercials. We're at number 5. We're talking about Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society. One of the biggest changes that took place during this time period had to do with the Supreme Court. Earl Warren, that you see there, was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court during this time. And the Warren Court pursued a policy of judicial activism from 1953 until 1969. What is judicial activism? It has to do with interpreting the law and the Constitution broadly to address what the judges perceived as major social problems. As we discussed in the last chapter, Brown versus Board of Education ended segregation in public schools. There is nothing in the Constitution about segregation or desegregation, or schools for that matter. And so the fact that the court acted on segregation shows the judicial activism, the morality of fighting for it, much more important than the constitutionality. And so that's the judicial activism, the stance that many on the Supreme Court is going to take during this time. The court also handed down decisions touching all areas of American life. Another court case was called Gidding versus Wainwright. This court ruling required the state to provide an attorney for defendants who could not afford one. Another court case was called Miranda versus Arizona. It required that criminal suspects be informed of their constitutional rights before they could be questioned. You know what that is. You have the right to remain silent, and so on and so forth. Another court case was Engel versus Vitale. This court ruling banned state-sponsored prayers in public schools as an alleged violation of the First Amendment. I find it interesting that for over 150 years, prayer was allowed in public school. But suddenly, in the 1950s and 60s, it was suddenly found out to be unconstitutional. And apparently that is the final ruling on that issue. Another court case was called Roth versus United States. It ruled that obscenity was not protected under freedom of speech, but it defined obscenity so narrowly that the decision actually struck down many obscenity laws. So this law was intended to curtail obscenities, pornography and those things, but instead it actually furthered it. As a result, an underground pornography industry flourished in the U.S. by the 1960s. Question is asked, is judicial activism good or bad? That is up for debate. One of the justices, Justice John Harlan, disagreed with the majority of the court. He said, "The Constitution is not a panacea for every blot upon the public welfare, nor should this court ordained as a judicial body be thought of as a general haven for reform movements. This court does not serve its high purpose when it exceeds its authority even to satisfy justified impatience with the slow workings of the political process." However, a majority of Harlan's associates did not heed his warning. Eisenhower had appointed 5 Supreme Court justices, including Earl Warren and William Brennan Jr. Once, when asked whether he had made any mistakes while as president, Eisenhower replied, "Yes, 2, and they are both sitting on the Supreme Court. Whew, that's rough. Big letter B. Now let's talk about Johnson and Vietnam, the Vietnam War. The U.S. had committed to maintaining the non-communist government in South Vietnam since Eisenhower's presidency. He had sent over 2,000 military advisors to train the South Vietnamese to fight for themselves. Under Kennedy, that number rose to 16,000. The U.S. continued to get dragged deeper and deeper into the mess. The more the U.S. tried to free itself, the more entangled it became. Soon the advisors became combatants, and the U.S. became engaged in a full-fledged war. Number one, escalation. If you look at page 557, it shows you a map of the Vietnam War. This map will be very helpful for you in an upcoming homework assignment. During the election of 1964, Johnson said, "We are not about to send American boys 9,000 or 10,000 miles away from home to do what Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves." Yet an incident changed everything. It was called the Gulf of Tonkin Issue, or the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. In the summer of 1964, the American destroyer Maddox allegedly repulsed an attack by North Vietnamese patrol boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. That's worth noting right there. The incident was minor, but Johnson denounced the attack and demanded action. So, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, approved by Congress, and this is also what you need to know, gave the president the power to take all necessary measures in dealing with the communists in Vietnam. Basically, it allowed Johnson to escalate the war in Vietnam. With this resolution, Johnson began to escalate the war. In 1968, U.S. forces numbered more than 500,000 people. U.S. bombers extended the war to North Vietnam by bombing supply lines and military sites. But what made Vietnam so difficult to fight? Why was the Vietnam War difficult to win? Well, first of all, letter A, the war was not a clear-cut conflict between two separate nations. The U.S. was fighting both the North Vietnamese and pro-communist South Vietnamese guerrillas. Not the monkey guerrillas, but people who will fight at home. The Viet Cong, what you need to know about them is they were pro-communist South Vietnamese guerrilla fighters. Guerrilla. Also, the fact was that they were fighting in the jungles. The fighting took place between the major cities in the jungles. The South Vietnamese controlled the cities. The Viet Cong controlled the countryside, so that's where the U.S. had to fight. Also, North Vietnam was supplied by China and the USSR. Both China and the Soviet Union supplied the enemy with weapons. Another reason why this war was so difficult was the Viet Cong supplies traveled through neighboring neutral countries, such as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Ho Chi Minh Trail crossed through neutral Laos and Cambodia. If you're still looking at the map on 557, you can see the red arrow signifying the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Such supply lines would be impossible to cut without attacking those nations, and the American political leaders were hesitant to do so. After all, that would expand the war beyond Vietnam. Letter C, the government of South Vietnam was corrupt, undemocratic, and unstable. But they weren't communist. The only advantage it offered to Americans was that it was, quote-unquote, better than the communists. Letter D, the U.S. civilian government sought to micromanage the war. Rather than setting a broad strategy and letting the military professionals determine the tactics appropriate for executing the strategy, the President and Congress let politics and the next election determine their decision-making. Let the professionals do it. should have been the mantra. Instead, it was the politicians micromanaging the government. And letter E, Johnson was committed to a limited defensive war. And this is probably the most important point. Maybe star this, highlight this, do what you need to do. He did not want to risk an outright war against North Vietnam. He feared drawing China or the USSR into the fight directly, like we had seen in Korea. He didn't want to divert the billions of dollars going to his Great Society to fight this war. The communist strategy for winning the war rested more on exhausting the Americans than on actually defeating them in the field. In 1975, an American Army officer on a diplomatic mission to North Vietnam told a North Vietnamese officer, "You know, you never defeated us on the battlefield." The Vietnamese officer replied, "That may be so, but it is also irrelevant." The communists knew that they did not have to win battles. They just had to keep fighting until Americans lost their will to win. Turn your books to page 558. I want you to read the second paragraph that starts out with, "For many soldiers." Once you finish reading that paragraph, please unpause the video and we'll continue. Some American troops were assigned to unleash chemical defoliants, such as Agent Orange, on the jungles of Vietnam to destroy the enemy's cover. These U.S. troops took as their motto a grim spoof of an American conservationist slogan, "Only you can prevent forests." Tragically, a number of Vietnam veterans have suffered from some cancers and other serious health ailments that appear to be related to their exposure to herbicides used during the war, particularly Agent Orange. Number 2, the Tet Offensive, lies and deceptions. At first, only a small minority opposed the war, generally from college-age students. Most Americans supported the war, partially due to the misrepresentation and outright deception by the government. Johnson feared that if the people knew how it was really going, he would lose support and his great society would crumble. All that the American people generally heard from the government were optimistic reports of how well the war was going. However, the media began to tell a different story. In 1968, we have the Tet Offensive. During the South Vietnamese celebration of Tet, the Lunar New Year, the Tet Offensive was launched. What you need to know about it is it was a massive surprise attack led by the Viet Cong on major cities and strategic points in South Vietnam. Leading up to the incident, the Viet Cong had smuggled arms into the cities, for example, by carrying them in coffins during funeral processions. 60,000 Viet Cong attacked. One force even captured part of the U.S. Embassy for a time. In the weeks that followed the attacks, the U.S. and South Vietnamese drove back the enemy, recapturing what had been lost and inflicting massive casualties on the enemy. So, yes, it was bad, but yes, we were able to push them back. Problem was the media backlash. Although it was a major failure for the communists, it had a dramatic effect on the American public. Television newscasts emphasized only the negative aspects, leading many Americans to believe that Tet was a communist victory. Maybe we should consider the phrase, "you reap what you sow." Having misled the American people and media about the course of the war, the government now faced the wrath of a public who wanted to know how things could come so close to disaster so suddenly. After Tet, many Americans no longer looked to win the war, they only wanted a way out. Number 3, the Paris peace talks. After Tet, North Vietnam offered to hold peace talks. It began with a heated discussion over the critical topic of what shape the table should be. The U.S. wanted out, but wanted to preserve South Vietnam's independence. North Vietnam wanted to reunite with South Vietnam under a communist government. The talks droned on for 5 years as the casualties mounted. That's all we're going to cover for today. For your homework, first of all, please take the quiz over 553 to 559. Take that quiz. Also, page 146 in your activities book. Page 146 is a map of the Vietnam War. I told you where you can find a map in the book to help you. That should be good. Hope you all have a good rest of the day. Be good, do good. Bye.